my kids love to create. In fact, in this very room, this is our office, my kids have behind us, a whole bunch of artistic art supplies, and behind the camera on the other side, there's a table full of paints and everything. You can see piano that I play and a guitar, and we love to create. We love to just play around and have a good time creating things. And I, one of the theologies that kind of captivates me the most is this theology of creation, this creative theology that we create because our God is a creative God, and so we're emulating God's creative activity in our creative work. We're in this series of videos called The Divine Above and The Divine Below, and we've been looking at how God interacts with people both in his transcendent forms, the way that he's over us, the way he's above us, the way sometimes we think of him as incomprehensible and majestic, and then how he takes that transcendence and then condescends to be with us. And we've been doing that by looking at the creative work of one particular artist. His name is Sufjan Stevens. And so if you haven't seen the first few video lessons, I encourage you to go back and see those. And Sufjan is primarily considered a musician, but he also is a visual artist as well, which we've talked about a little bit. But the last couple of albums that we've looked at have been primarily, actually totally instrumental music. And so you really are given the latitude to interpret pretty wildly what the notes that are being transmitted through your speakers or through your headphones, what they mean. And given the content or given the context in which Sufjan was writing, we've been doing that. We've talked about God's communicative activity through the Holy Spirit by looking at how Sufjan unpacked the Chinese zodiac in Enjoy Your Rabbit. We talked about how Sufjan, was able to transform the mundane ugliness of the Brooklyn Queens Expressway into both movie and soundtrack and essay and even comic book. And so that was a pretty cool kind of exploration. It's one of my favorite explorations that I've done when I've studied Sufjan Stevens and that redemptive kind of aspect of things. But as we zoom out, Sufjan's most recent record, most recent album is actually a collaboration with several other artists, all contributed to this latest release, which is called Planetarium. And Planetarium was actually an experimental record that was kind of created first in live settings and then taken to the recording studio just last year, and then this latest record, Planetarium, was just released earlier in 2017. And so it's Sufjan's most recent record, but it deals with the largest topic that you can deal with, and that's the planets. I mean, that's the solar system, that's the cosmos. People have always been fascinated with space. They fascinated with space, and in ancient times it would just be kind of looking at the night sky and formulating mythology based on how the stars were arranged, and you get the constellations, which really don't exist except in our imagination. We see patterns in the sky, and ancients created kind of not just the images, but also the narratives behind the images. And that's essentially kind of what Sufjan Stevens has done in Planetarium with the lyrical content of this record. And Diana Butler Bass wrote a book called Grounded. And in this book, she talks about our fascination with the sky. And this is what she writes. She says, "To say that God is in the sky is not to imply that God lives in a certain address above the earth. Instead, it is an invitation to consider God's presence that both reaches to the stars and wafts through our lives as a spiritual breeze." Bass actually ties in the Hebrew and Greek words for wind and shows how they are also used as translations of God's Spirit. and how the wind and the air and the sky calls us to a heightened sense of the divine. And what Sufjan Stevens does lyrically in Planetarium is to point us to the sky. And he weaves all these different lines of narrative into unpacking various aspects of our solar system. And the first track I want you to take a listen to is the track Jupiter on Planetarium, and then we'll talk about that for just a little bit.
Father of light, Father of death, give us your wisdom, give us your breath. Solar says that Jupiter is the loneliest planet. Red bright eye, put in its place. Under your foot, carpenter's cape. Son of death says Jupiter is the loneliest planet. Floundering star, feel that you are. Fevering ditch, figure of speech. Son of death says Jupiter is the loneliest planet. Say it with force, say it to my face. Put me in place. Son of death says Jupiter is the only balance. Any art, any gaze. Wandering star, put up your face. Son of death says Jupiter is the only balance.
So before we actually talk about the music, which I think is pretty great, and talk about the lyrics, which I think are pretty remarkable, we should understand that when Stevens is unpacking the solar system, just like he does with a lot of his work, he doesn't just stick with the particular object, but he deals with a lot of kind of ideas that surround that object. So for Jupiter, for example, it is the largest planet in our solar system, and it's named after the Roman version of the Greek god Zeus. So Jupiter was the supreme god in the Roman pantheon of gods and was related to Zeus, who was the supreme god in the pantheon of Greek gods. And Edith Hamilton, back in the 60s, wrote the definitive work on mythology. And it's interesting what she had to say about Zeus, because, you know, in our understanding of Zeus, we just think of him as this lightning-wielding sort of god, and he kind of got what he wanted. But this is what she writes in her book called Mythology. Edith Hamilton, she actually quotes Homer's Iliad. in Zeus' own self-description. He says this about himself. He says, I am the mightiest of all. Make trial that you may know. Fasten a rope of gold to heaven and lay hold every god and goddess. You could not drag down Zeus. And yet Hamilton points out that Zeus was not without his numerous faults and foibles. And so Jupiter kind of takes those characteristics on as well. He could be tricked. He could be duped. He was not omniscient. He wasn't omnipresent. And so Stevens, when he's writing these lyrics about Jupiter, the planet, and also the mythology surrounding the name Jupiter, he sings this. He says, Father of light, Father of death, give us your wisdom, give us your breath. Sumner says that Jupiter is the loneliest planet. Red right eye put in its place, under your foot, carpenter's cape. Sermon of Death says Jupiter is the loneliest planet. Floundering star, failed that you are, fevering pitch, figure of speech. Sermon of Death says Jupiter is the loneliest planet. See, the irony in Stevens' lyrics is that Jupiter, the planet, is the largest in our solar system, and yet often people have thought of Jupiter scientifically as a failed star, that there's failure built into the idea of Jupiter as a planet. Now, scientists debate whether Jupiter is actually a failed dwarf brown planet or not, but Stevens jumps on this idea of failure and the foibles and faults of Zeus, or Jupiter, the Roman version, to point out something pretty, I think, spectacular about our attempts to achieve greatness. He says this, he ties this idea of fatherhood with Zeus and Jupiter being the father of the gods and the father of the heroes in Greek and Roman mythology with his own father. He talks about the curse of Adam, labor, and how his father had to work and work and work and work to achieve what he could never quite grasp. He talks about Lucifer in the lyrics. This idea that the fallen angel Lucifer in Christian mythology tried to grasp after something that he couldn't quite get a hold of. The creation story in Genesis chapter 1, I encourage you to open your Bibles to it if you have it. It's going to be on the screen. And we're not going to go verse by verse through this, but this is beautiful poetry. Beautiful poetry about God's creative work. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And so begins the cycle, the poetic cycle of God's speaking creation into existence. And at every point in the cycle, at every end of the cycle, he says, it is good. His creation is good. He achieves exactly what he sets out to do. And yet, our achievement to be like God, it falls short. In Genesis chapter 11, just 10 chapters after this, human beings try to achieve something great apart from their relationship to God. And this is what it says in Genesis chapter 11. It says, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. Now, I want to stop right there. When we read that the whole earth had one language and the same words, we think, oh my gosh, this unity. I mean, we live in a time of terrible division, and we're thinking, it would be so amazing if we just kind of get together and be unified. And yet this is what the people did with their unity. It says, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the whole face of the earth. You know, see, what happens is the people get together and their desire is to reach the heavens. Apart from any kind of intervention of God themselves, they try to reach the heights of God. They try to reach this kind of mythical, fantastical summit of heaven apart from God. And as the story continues, God comes down to see this great tower. The tower is so wonderful that even God has to descend and condescend to even see it. And they're frustrated in their attempts to reach these great heights. You know, even the solar system, as marvelous as it is, it points us to God, but then our stories that we put on top of it only indicate our frustration with trying to achieve power apart from God himself. You know, and another song on Planetarium is the song Mars. And I want you to go ahead and stop and just take a listen to this song from the album Planetarium. So the song Mars is about the planet I think that most human beings have been fascinated with, probably more than any other. We're always fascinated with visitors from Mars and trying to get to Mars. One of my favorite movies is Matt Damon's The Martian. I just think that's a great movie, and it's a fascinating look at what if we actually got there. And that's probably, if we're getting to another planet, that's probably the one that we're getting to first. I'm not no scientific data, but I do enough, watching of the space program to know that's where they're headed. And we're fascinated by it because, to some extent it's relatively close, I guess, as planets go to us. But it's red, it's kind of got this fiery look, but it's got a solid surface that we can land on. We've done a lot of, pre-exploration for it. And yet it's named after Mars, the Roman equivalent of the god Ares, the Greek god Ares. And Mars is the god of war. I think it's pretty amazing that the planet that we're most fascinated with, Mars, is named after the god of war. And how violent are we? In this song, Sufjan begins to unpack this fascination with war. He says this: I am the god of war. I reside in every creature. Dispose of the future or put away your sword. And the problem is set against this question: will we see the Lord? As the song shifts musically, Stevens begins to offer up a possible solution to this fascination with war. And he talks about love and how love can kind of bring people together. But at the same time, in the lyrics, you'll notice that love can also be, and often is, the most ready excuse we have for war. It's love of country, it's love of freedom, it's love of democracy, it's love of our way of life. It's love of religion, in certain cases. The Crusades were predicated on a love for the Holy Land and a desire to reclaim it out of a love for religion. And so we have this sort of push and pull, with love being the great antidote to war and sometimes its biggest motivating factor. Even our love is tainted. Even our love is tainted. This is a theme that Sufjan Stevens unpacks in other songs on Planetarium, from Venus to Saturn, especially Saturn. And I encourage you to go and find that video on YouTube and see how it relates to that idea of Mars. I think the questions that we really have to wrestle with is, what are we trying to achieve in our creative efforts? As God has achieved life, and then even in the face of death, He's given us new life in Jesus Christ. What are we trying to achieve in our efforts? And what can we learn about God's relationship to us in our successes? God is this great and awesome and majestic and powerful creator, this creative maker God. And He calls us to also create and make and be transformers of our surroundings. But to what end? Will it lead to something great that brings people together, that unifies people, that points people to God's great work? Or will it lead to more war, more division, more hatred? In the time right before this record Planetarium was going to be released, Sufjan Stevens put up what looked like a photograph of the Genesis 1 account of God's creation. And it made me think, on his website, Sufjan.com, and it made me think, what kind of creative beings are we? Are we good at creating loveliness, goodness, hope, beauty, something eternal that will last? Hope you'll think about that, and that you will join us next time for the divine above and the divine below.